In 1915, James T. Irving and his wife Margaret used their life savings and purchased a small farm in the hills of Dorless Cashen, aka Cashens Gap, on the Isle of Man located in the Irish Sea, sitting roughly 90 miles off the coast of Great Britain and Ireland. He and his wife had become aware of the nature of the times and sought to move themselves away from the insanity of the world abroad in an attempt to save their family the bitterness of what was to become one of the darker periods of human history as nations entered into the early stages of World War I. They, along with their teenage son Thomas, began a prospering sheep farm with the countryside mostly to themselves and relative peace from the outside world among the abandoned homesteads, with their nearest neighbors few and distant. The Irvings sought privacy above all, which in part lends credence to the strange and somewhat cartoonish story that was to unfold around them. Manx people of the time believed vehemently in spirits that were said to roam the hills and dark spaces in between the world of the living and the dead, with witches creeping beyond mortal reach and fairies always observing just out of sight. So much so that on May Day Eve, people would burn gorse bushes, believing the fires would drive evil spirits hiding in the shadows of night from their abodes and banish them from the island, protecting the inhabitants for a time. By 1918, the Irving's daughter Vory was born. An energetic though quiet and sometimes reserved girl, she spent most of her days roaming the island from top to bottom. Soon after Vory's birth, the Irving's son Thomas moved to London to make his own way, and the Irvings settled into a smaller but still comfortable version of the farming life they had become accustomed to up till now. In September of 1931, things took a very strange turn for everyone at the farm. After a particularly long day, Thomas and Vory had returned home and were accompanied by a neighbor of whom Mr. Irving would sometimes do extra work in exchange for profit in selling potatoes and sundry rabbits at the end of the season. The sun had set by the time the family and their visitor gathered around the single paraffin lamp that lit the living room to enjoy supper and evening conversation. Flickering light of the fireplace from the nearby kitchen cast dancing shadows about the room and faint glow illuminating the walls decorated with paintings of a Maori chief with tattooed face and solemn expression. Vory and her mother Margaret were discussing school activities while the men planned the upcoming day's work, when gradually a slight rustling could be heard coming from just behind the walls at the south end of the room. They paused for a moment but heard nothing and continued talking. However, no sooner had conversation resumed when the scratching and rustling sound could be heard again. This time, fearing an animal had nested in the walls, James walked over to that side of the room and tapped on the wall. The sound immediately stopped again, yet scurrying could be heard moving farther up into the corner closer to the ceiling rafters, and again, silence. James and the neighbor both agreed that it was likely a polecat and were discussing ridding the home of the nuisance when the rustling sounds began again. Only this time the hair raised on the back of everyone's necks as the sounds of a crying human baby, loud and accompanied by the same scratching noises, filled the room. The stunned residents, now speechless, left wide-eyed and staring at the wall of the farmhouse and the isolated countryside. The Irvings began running over possibilities as to what the sounds could be as James began peeling the paneling back to try and get a glimpse of what could possibly be in the wall. Margaret, having superstitious roots and native Manx blood running in her veins with deep ties to this area, stated without a doubt that these sounds were from a spirit. James and their neighbor, however, weren't ready to accept this theory just yet. As the wall panels were pulled away, James caught a glimpse of a large, fluffy yellow tail as it skittered off across the wall studs, up the ceiling framework, and out of sight. The noises stopped, and they were satisfied they had found the culprit. They decided to trap the animal the next day and said goodbye to their guest and turned in for the night. Not long after going to bed, however, the noises returned, though this time the sound that came from the walls was that of a barking dog. At first, they believed the culprit to be Mona, the Irving sheepdog, who had caught the scent of the animal, though this was ruled out when they realized Mona was nowhere around, and even after she was located nearby and brought to the house, the sounds continued. Sleep was constantly interrupted all through the night. Persistent scratching, barking, whimpering, and occasional cries of a small baby would startle them awake. The sounds would change at times to resemble a bird chirping, and even more strange, Margaret and Vory both thought several times that night they heard a faint giggling coming from behind the walls. All that next day, James and his neighbor tried to locate the animal, plugging holes, setting traps, to no avail. By nightfall, they hoped the animal had gone. Unfortunately, after the sun went down, the sounds began again. Like the previous night, none of their efforts did anything to stop the continuing noises coming from inside the walls, rafters, and at times even under the Irving's floor. And again, like the previous night, the sounds continued until morning and abruptly stopped. These events continued as days turned into weeks, and nightly disturbances were beginning to get the better of the Irvings. Margaret, holding interest in spiritual mediumship, as well as knowledge of the paranormal and strange history of Cashens Gap, tried to make peace with what she perceived as an angry ghost many times herself. These attempts failed, and at a point the sounds began being heard in the daytime as well as the night and in various areas of the farm. Objects would be thrown seemingly from nowhere, and whistling, growling sounds could be heard, always just out of sight. The events continued with the family, as well as locals sometimes catching glimpses of an odd-looking creature with a small body like that of a rat and a large bushy yellow-furred tail that could sometimes be seen running the fence lines and darting through the weeds and underbrush around the farm. Some even claimed to have spotted the creature hiding among other animals, yet any attempts at a closer look always resulted in the animal quickly jolting away out of sight. One day while working, Vori and her mother looked out the window at their chickens in the yard and noticed a small animal much like the one they and others had seen recently. The chickens seemed unbothered by the creature, and as it sat there partially obscured from view, they heard the same familiar sound seemingly coming from that area. Suddenly the animal seemed to take notice and ran away into the tall grass. One night, in utter frustration, James began mimicking the sounds back at the walls. Surprisingly, the creature began to mock the sounds in return. Whatever sounds they made would always receive a similar response. When someone whistled like a bird, the sound would repeat back. If someone made the sound of a cat, meowing began inside the walls. Locals began to keep their distance from the farm, being unsettled at what was happening and leaving the Irvings much to their own with these strange occurrences. Vori eventually started leaving food out for the animal to try to lure it out of hiding and into the open for a better look. The creature, ever the trickster, seemed to always wait until the perfect time to sneak out and grab the food when no one was paying attention and scurry back into hiding. After a while, Vori claimed to have made friends with the animal and would recite nursery rhymes and read books to the creature hiding within the walls of the old farmhouse. This being the case, the creature apparently stopped tormenting the family at night, though it would still make its presence known often. Once this talk reached the newspapers, curious researchers and skeptics began reaching out to the Irvings. One day, a well-known member of the National Laboratory Council and friend of famed psychic researcher Harry Price, named Captain MacDonald, arranged a visit in an attempt to study the case on behalf of his colleague who was busy on another investigation. Though the Irvings were growing tired of the publicity, they agreed to let an investigation take place. They first showed the captain all of the areas they believed the animal used to travel the home, then had lunch and talked until the evening with nothing eventful taking place. The captain suggested coming back another time, and James agreed to drive him to his hotel in town. The men were heading toward the door when something that stunned everyone happened. A shrill voice from inside the wall shrieked out, "Who is that man? Go away!" Everyone stood confused, and Vori grabbed her father's arm excitedly and exclaimed, "That's him!" Apparently, the voice continued to chatter in the walls for several minutes, making various sounds and words, but most was unintelligible. Captain MacDonald settled back down and stayed longer, attempting to cause more activity, but soon after it began, the house again fell silent. After a while, he decided to leave for his hotel and return again the next day. When morning came, Captain MacDonald returned and was greeted by Jim and his wife, who told him the creature had continued talking after he had left the night before. That day, the captain claimed to have heard what he now dubbed as the man-weasel speak many times, addressing him directly, letting all know in no uncertain terms that the captain was not welcome here, and also that the captain did not believe in him. At one point, things began being thrown from behind a panel which flew across the room, striking a teapot. The Irvings explained that the creature seemed to always throw things when it became upset. As they sat there, they could hear dishes rattle in the kitchen and something scurrying through the walls and into different areas of the home, and even at one point liquid was seen trickling from behind the paneling down the wall, which James explained was the animal performing its natural functions. By late in the evening, the weasel had quieted its assault, and the captain was preparing to leave when he stopped and stated aloud he believed in the animal and asked it to come down. A voice promptly responded, "No, and I don't mean you to stay long, as I don't like you." After this, he decided to stay and continue his investigation until midnight. However, nothing more took place that night. Over time, the family became fond of the talking weasel, though it never allowed itself to be seen in full. James would have long discussions with the creature, and eventually it told them its name was Jeff, and that it was an earthbound spirit and a ghost in the form of a mongoose trapped in this unfortunate form. It stated, "I have hands and feet, and if you saw me, you would faint. You'd be petrified, mummified, turned into a pillar of salt." Anytime someone asked to see Jeff, he would refuse and claim that if anyone ever actually saw him completely, they would lose their minds in terror. He also described himself as having a small body like that of a rat and large bushy yellow tail and normal hands and feet. He also claimed to have been born in New Delhi, India in 1852. Jeff was not particularly fond of Margaret, though he was affectionate towards Vory and James. It was claimed that Jeff would spy on Margaret often and climb onto the bed at night and whisper to her before running away. Jeff was said to go into town and hide and return with local gossip from the townsfolk. He was even known to visit neighboring farms and homes and sometimes make his presence known there as well. When asked, the Irvings would claim that Jeff had become helpful to the family and would warn them of unannounced guests and dogs that came onto their land. It was even claimed that if the family forgot to put out the stove at night, that Jeff would come down and turn the stove off for the family. Visitors claimed Jeff would wake people who overslept, and anytime mice became an issue, Jeff assumed the role of a house cat and rid the home of them, though he didn't prefer to kill them. Locals claimed that Jeff loved eating bananas and biscuits left for him in a special dish suspended high on the ceiling, which he would eat when no one was paying attention. Jeff would sometimes follow the Irvings to town, where people observed hearing sounds of chattering coming from nearby bushes when the Irvings were around. Jeff was quite the talker by this point and had become close with the family. Jeff would even talk politics and theology, and he would chatter for long periods of time about different events past and present. He also knew several languages and was noted by one researcher to have stated, "I will split the atom. I'm the fifth dimension. I am the eighth wonder of the world." The British press began chronicling the story of Jeff the Talking Mongoose, and many reporters claimed to have personally witnessed the phenomenon and heard the voice of the creature speak, though the Irvings grew increasingly weary of the press and intrusion into their privacy. As word spread about Jeff the Talking Mongoose, people came from all over to try to catch a glimpse of the so-called man-weasel, and several claimed to have caught glimpses of him and even spoken to Jeff. There were always skeptics as well. Jeff's existence could never be verified by investigators or scientists who visited the home. However, none could prove the occurrence as a hoax either. There are many debunking claims that have been made over the years. Everything from supposed ventriloquism by the Irvings, even their sheepdog caught the blame at one point. It has also been claimed that the Irvings created the story somehow to make money by creating a spectacle that proved to ruin their standing in the community, decimated their privacy, cost them all of their money and savings, and drove away their help, and ultimately led them to sell their home after constant harassment, even after the death of family patriarch James T. Irving in 1945. Despite all this, the Irvings remained kind and civil and still welcomed guests into their home and treated them well despite the harassment and wishes to be left alone. One particular skeptic named Arthur Morrison spent the night with the Irvings in an attempt to disprove the creature, stating many times aloud he did not believe in Jeff. Apparently, upon arrival, Jeff threatened the man's life and continued to harass him during his entire stay. Arthur still claimed Jeff a fake and demanded that he show himself. That night, Arthur stayed with the family and was awoken by a loud banging coming from under his bed. Upon looking under his bed, he was met with two glowing red eyes, and a dark voice whispered,
"Now do you believe?"
Jeff angrily kept everyone in the house awake that night, with constant banging and scratching and throwing various objects, and even coming into full view several times for Arthur to see. Sadly, after the death of James, the family could no longer tend the land and sold the farm at a huge loss of money due to the reputation of the property. In 1946, an actor named Leslie Graham bought the property and not long after claimed to the press that he had managed to shoot and kill Jeff, even proudly displaying a picture to the papers. However, the picture that the papers published showed a larger than previously described creature with black and white coloring. Vory was presented with the photograph from the paper, and she said without a doubt that this was not Jeff. Vory maintained that the story was truthful till the day she died in 2005 and never once changed her story. To this day, no one knows the fate of Jeff the Talking Mongoose of Dolores Cashen. For all we know, he may still roam the island.